Hi class, let's take a look at levels of measurement, and we're basically going to talk about 4 levels of measurement. This is how the researcher would be categorizing its data set. So the first level of measurement is what we talk about nominal. Now, in an event that happens to be labeled as nominal, you're just looking at categories where every member of the population actually has to fit, and it's understood that every one of the members would have to fit under one of these categories. So for example, if they ask a question, you would answer yes, no, or undecided. There is nothing else, or there is no other category that it's not actually given. If it's basically about a political affiliation, somebody will either fit Democrat, Republican, Independent, or other. So when we talk about levels of measurement that happen to be nominal, every member of the population has to fit under one of those, and it's understood for everybody that yes means yes, no means no, or undecided. So there couldn't be any misinterpretations. For example, anybody filling out a survey would have to fit under any one of these categories. Now, let's take a look at ordinal. Now, one main difference on ordinal is that it still labels, but there is a minor discrepancy. So for example, when we talked about nominal, you were either Democrat, Republican, Independent, or other. But here, the letter grades or the actual label that it's given, it's not actually universal. So for example, if you're looking at letter grades, well, for our class, you would be given one of these. But in other countries, they're actually not using A's, they're using a numerical value. So ordinal, it's a label, but it's not universal. Example, if you were to buy a shirt, well, the sizes are not universal. It depends on what audience they're targeting. So for example, somebody in a specific brand may be L, and another one, they may be XL. Movie ratings, technically they can use any category there for movie ratings. So ordinal represents labels, but they're not universal. Let's talk about actual measurements that deal with numerical values. Now, if there is no natural zero, that data value happens to be called an interval. So for example, if you're looking at, well, the years, we're looking at 2020 for our year at the moment. That's based on a specific birth, and another country may have a different counting value for their years. So when we talk about interval, there's no natural zero, or the zero is not universal. Now, when we talk about ratio, in ratio, you do have a natural zero. Zero is universal for everybody in the population. Example, distance. The minimum that somebody can actually drive is 0 distance, meaning that they didn't move the car, and price is 0 price. So ratio is universal. Interval, it's not. Let me go back to the previous one. Ordinal, it's not universal. Nominal, nominal, it's actually universal. For this specific one, please take a picture, because some of these examples are going to actually show up on the homework assignments, and here you have all the levels of measurements already technically dissected. Okay, let's take a look at types of sampling. So the basic idea is that a researcher is going to be trying to look for some sample, and from that sample, predictions will be made. So let's talk about the types of sampling. Now, if they were to mention stratify or cluster, in this case, they're looking at large samples. The population may be really, really large. So one of the main conditions that we have with stratified, it's basically with the following. You're going to have groups, and they talk about at least 2 on any of the 2 cases. But you're basically breaking the samples or the population into many groups, and then you're creating sampling from each. The main idea is that if you happen to be running a stratified, every one of the groups actually gets selected. So for example, let's assume that you divide the population into states. However, you have to have at least 2. And the main idea is that each state is actually surveyed. So basically you divide at least the data set into perhaps California and Nevada, and then you get data from both. Now, cluster represents the data may be larger. So one of the main differences in cluster is that as you collect the data set, the actual groups are so large, and we're talking about these groups, that it's sufficient to just basically collect one of these for the actual data set. So in cluster, you're only selecting one, and stratified, you technically survey from all of them. Let's take a look at systematic. Now, in systematic, you select, or the researcher selects, a specific way on collecting values. Example, let's assume that you're going to do a survey and you get a hold of an actual phone book. In that case, you may decide, or the researcher may decide, to survey every 5th, every 10th value. The value of kth, it's basically a number that's selected by the researcher. There's actually a formula that will show up later. And the idea is that if you select every 5th, you start counting at 0, or technically 1, and then every 5th value after that. If we talk about a convenience sampling, in a convenience sampling, the main idea is that the researcher and whoever they're sampling, they're easily accessible. So if it's easily accessible from the researcher to the subjects, in that case, it's a convenient sampling. In this case, you could be looking at someone surveying their family members. They technically live with that individual. Let's take a look at another definition that's gonna actually show up soon. And this is the idea of a lurking variable. Now, a lurking variable, it's basically some sort of process that it's not actually analyzed by the researcher. So for example, let's assume that they're coming up with a new medicine. And as they're coming up with a new medicine, they happen to look or overlook at a vitamin, and they don't realize that that vitamin, as it is combined with medicine, may have a positive or negative effect. So a lurking variable, it's some sort of statistical process that it's not taken into account as we run a study. Unfortunately, lurking variables, when the researcher finds out that something's affecting the study, it's actually too late. It could be that they're looking at a medicine, and it's already out there in the field. Let's take a look at, well, the next definition, and we're talking about an outlier. Now, when we talk about an outlier, it's basically by inspection, and we're looking at a data value that's too far from the rest. So for example, if you were to look at this data set, and the data set represents quiz scores, you would actually conclude that 12, it's too far from the other one. In that case, by inspection, we could qualify 12 as a possible outlier. So it's just basically by inspection. Now, the last one before we go to the next video, we're talking about a frame. In a frame, you're looking at the actual list where the researcher is basically recording every member of the population. So if somebody were to look at an actual frame, they could see who was the actual subject that was selected, what was the age, what was everything with respect to that subject. For our class, the grade book, it's actually, a frame. Actually a frame because it has, everyone's data. You could be looking at names, W, number, gender. I think we have access to your address. I'm not sure. But everything in there, definitely phone numbers we do.